France, September 1944. The rain falls in thin silver lines over the wreckage of what used to be a road. The forest is quiet now, too quiet, except for the distant crack of artillery somewhere beyond the hills. A jeep sits half buried in mud, its olive paint scarred by shrapnel, its windshield cracked like glass ice. Near it, a woman in a mud-stained field uniform kneels beside a wounded soldier. Her hands move fast, sure, practiced. She presses gauze to his chest, whispering to keep him awake. Around her, the air smells of fuel, blood, and damp earth. The aid station she came from is gone. Shelled hours earlier, the evacuation trucks never arrived. There are dozens of men here, scattered along the trees, too injured to move. The radio is dead. The front line is shifting backward. She looks at the Jeep again. Keys still in the ignition. Technically, it isn't hers, but the thought of leaving these men here, behind enemy lines, is unbearable. She wipes rain from her face, takes one last breath, and climbs into the driver's seat. The engine coughs, then roars. History begins to turn. By the late summer of 1944, the Second World War had entered its most brutal, fluid phase. The Allied invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord, had succeeded, but victory was far from assured. The beaches had given way to hedgerows, and every field in northern France had become a fortress. For the men pushing eastward toward Germany, the pace was relentless. For the medics and nurses behind them, the suffering was unimaginable. The Allied lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles. Combat units advanced faster than their support columns could follow. Fuel, ammunition, and food ran dangerously low. Medical supplies ran out even faster. Field hospitals were often set up within range of enemy artillery, sometimes only hours before being forced to move again. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps had grown to more than 50,000 women by that year, a quiet army of compassion moving in lockstep with chaos. They served in tents, barns, and shattered churches, turning makeshift shelters into places of triage and mercy. Many were barely in their 20s. They learned to improvise without sleep, to treat wounds by lantern light, and to steel themselves against the screams that came with every convoy of stretchers. Their mission was simple on paper: stabilize the wounded, prepare them for evacuation, and move them to field hospitals further behind the line. In reality, evacuation meant a desperate race against time and against the limits of human endurance. Ambulances and trucks were in short supply, and those that existed were constantly diverted to resupply combat units. When the front surged forward after the breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, July 1944, the medic units were told to keep up at all costs. Many didn't. Roads were clogged with retreating German vehicles and advancing Allied armor, and between them lay the wreckage of war: burned tanks, bodies, shattered bridges. It was a battlefield where even the Red Cross symbol offered no safety. Some nurses worked under commanders like General Patton's Third Army, whose rapid advance across France often left its medics cut off from logistics entirely. One nurse, later writing in a letter home, described driving 36 hours without sleep just to reach the wounded. The roads were alive with movement: tanks, horses, men on foot, and us. You could smell the cordite before you saw the smoke. We drove through villages that weren't there anymore. Behind such words lay exhaustion and fear, but also a fierce sense of purpose. These nurses didn't carry rifles. Their weapon was endurance, and a promise to bring every man home alive if humanly possible. In that brutal summer, one small vehicle became their lifeline: the Willys MB Jeep. Simple, light, and endlessly adaptable, it was the war's workhorse. It could ford streams, cross fields, and outrun most German patrols. Officially, it wasn't designed for medical evacuation. Unofficially, it became one anyway, a two-man rescue machine when nothing else was left. To a nurse stranded with dozens of wounded men and no evacuation support, a Jeep wasn't just transportation. It was hope with four wheels. In France's Lorraine region, near the crumbling edge of the Maginot Line,
the front shifted like quicksand. One moment, an aid station was safely behind Allied armor. The next, it was exposed, cut off by counterattacks or collapsing bridges. Many medical units found themselves trapped between advancing German rearguards and the rolling thunder of Allied artillery. It was here, in that no-man's land of confusion and mud, that one nurse, whose name was never formally recorded in after-action reports, made a choice that would echo through every field hospital from Normandy to the Rhine. She was part of a mobile surgical team attached to the U.S. Fifth Army, working with minimal supplies, limited communication, and no transport. When the bombardment came and the evacuation trucks failed to arrive, she faced an impossible decision: do nothing and watch men die, or take what wasn't hers and defy protocol. That's where the story of the stolen Jeep truly begins, not as an act of rebellion, but as a refusal to let war decide who lived and who didn't. The moment she turned that ignition key, she crossed not just a physical front line, but a moral one as well.
The stretch of countryside east of Verdun had once been quiet farmland. By September 1944, it was a scar of churned soil and broken villages, a landscape caught between two collapsing fronts. The German army, retreating toward the Moselle River, fought with desperate precision. The Allies, stretched thin from Normandy to the Siegfried Line, were running low on fuel and momentum. Medical units followed as best they could. Many were housed in whatever shelter remained: church basements, abandoned cafes, or dugouts reinforced with timber. Some nurses had worked for days without food, surviving on black coffee and adrenaline. Their field dressing stations overflowed with the wounded. Lacking morphine, they cut doses in half. Lacking bandages, they sterilized and reused them. Each morning, they waited for the rumble of trucks, the evacuation convoys that never came. Fuel shortages crippled logistics. Rain turned every road into a swamp. At times, the only vehicles moving freely were jeeps and motorcycles, small enough to weave through the wreckage, fast enough to dodge shell fire. Reports from the Lorraine campaign describe entire medical teams being left behind after the front surged forward. For the wounded, it meant hours, sometimes days, before reaching proper surgical care. For nurses, it meant confronting the slow, unbearable arithmetic of triage, deciding who could be saved and who could not. To understand the magnitude of what happened next, one must understand the mindset of these women. Army nurses were soldiers in every sense except the one officially recognized. They carried no weapons, wore no combat insignia, and were expected to obey the same strict chain of command that governed the rest of the military. Yet they served within reach of German guns, treating men under bombardment and often driving ambulances themselves when drivers were killed. Theirs was a war of discipline and mercy. Orders were everything until orders became impossible to follow. Among them was the unnamed nurse, remembered only through oral testimony from survivors and post-war letters. Some sources connect her to units stationed near Nancy, others to the 45th Field Hospital south of Metz. Her exact identity is less important than the truth of her act, an echo of dozens of similar moments that went unrecorded because they broke the rules. When the field station was cut off that night, she found herself with roughly 40 wounded men, most unable to walk. The radio was silent, and German patrols were moving along the ridge. She had no transport, no orders, and no time. Then, amid the scattered wreckage outside the aid post, she saw it. A jeep abandoned beside a collapsed fuel truck. The keys were still there, its tires half buried in mud. On its side, the white star of the U.S. Army, dulled by soot. Stealing military property was a court-martial offense. But she wasn't thinking about regulations anymore. Her concern was the moans behind her, the faint sounds of men calling out for water, for morphine, for home. Eyewitnesses later described seeing her drive into the dark, headlights off, rain slashing sideways, engine barely audible over the shell fire. She returned an hour later, the back of the Jeep piled with wounded soldiers she had dragged from nearby trenches and ditches. Then she left again. And again. By dawn, she had made several trips through what was effectively enemy-held territory, navigating by instinct and the intermittent flashes of gunfire. Her uniform was soaked through with blood and rain. Her hands trembled from exhaustion. The Jeep's engine sputtered, overheated, then roared back to life after every stop. Some say she carried over 400 men to safety in the span of 3 days, ferrying them between aid posts, forward clearing stations, and the nearest functioning ambulance route. The numbers vary by account, but the pattern does not. A single nurse, 1 Jeep, and an unbroken line of wounded survivors. When supply convoys finally reconnected with the unit, the story began to spread quietly through the medical corps, not as legend, but as whispered testimony to courage without command. She wasn't praised immediately. In fact, she was reprimanded for taking the vehicle without authorization. Yet every officer who signed that report also noted the same thing. Without her, hundreds of men would have died where they lay. Her Jeep was returned to the motor pool, scarred but intact. The nurse herself went back to work as if nothing had happened. There were always more men to save, more nights without sleep. But among those who saw it, soldiers, doctors, and drivers, her act became a symbol of what war sometimes demanded: quiet defiance in the face of bureaucracy. And it set the stage for what would follow: the deeper meaning of one vehicle, one decision, and one nurse's refusal to surrender to hopelessness. Because behind every statistic in war lies a human choice, and hers was about to echo across the front.
1. The human angle. War had stripped everything down to essentials: food, water, breath, heartbeat. For the nurse, compassion wasn't a luxury. It was the last discipline she could still control. Her world was defined by triage tags and the sound of stretchers scraping across mud. She'd long since stopped flinching at wounds. What haunted her were the eyes, the quiet ones, already fading, who asked if anyone would come back for them. In the field, nurses built an armor of calm. Panic was contagious. Tenderness, oddly, was not. Every decision was a moral calculation under fire. Who gets the last syringe of morphine? Who's worth another transfusion? Who can wait until morning? Those choices aged them in weeks. Letters home were cheerful lies written by candlelight. All fine here, the boys are brave, the weather's turning cold. But beneath the discipline burned something harder to extinguish: a fierce, almost stubborn humanity. When she saw those men left behind in the forest, something in her refused to obey the cold arithmetic of war. The stolen Jeep wasn't rebellion, it was defiance against the dehumanization that war demanded. Many nurses later spoke about the same instinct, that moment when duty blurred into something personal. They were told to obey orders, but they'd seen too much to believe that the rulebook always knew what was right. In her case, the moral weight of her choice wasn't heroism, it was survival, for them and for herself. Because when she took the wheel, there was no going back to being simply a nurse behind the line. She had crossed into the domain of those who fought without weapons. 2. The tactical angle. The U.S. Army's evacuation system in 1944 was a marvel on paper and a nightmare in practice. Its success depended entirely on movement: moving supplies, moving fuel, moving men. The entire machine was built to advance, not to stop. In combat zones like Lorraine, every minute counted. The ideal evacuation sequence went like this: medics retrieved the wounded, loaded them into jeeps or half-tracks, brought them to battalion aid stations, then onward to field hospitals. But when the front shifted faster than expected, as it often did, that system collapsed. The smallest disruption, a destroyed bridge or an ambushed convoy, could trap hundreds in a medical limbo. Jeep ambulances, often improvised versions with stretchers strapped across the rear, became vital. The official ambulance models, GMC CCKWs or Dodge WC-54s, were too large for narrow French lanes or shell-torn fields. A Jeep, light and low, could slip through enemy territory unnoticed, carrying 2 stretchers and a medic. The nurse understood this instinctively. She wasn't trained for tactical maneuvers, but she knew the terrain better than most officers. She'd driven supply routes for weeks, memorizing every turn between field stations. Her mission that night wasn't strategy, it was logistics born of necessity. The Jeep's simplicity made it the most valuable piece of machinery on the Western Front. Soldiers joked that you could fix one with a hammer, wire, and prayer, and they often did. It was waterproofed for river crossings, sturdy enough for mud, and nimble enough to dart through ruins. In military reports, vehicles like hers were sometimes listed as lost to enemy action. In truth, many were lost to mercy, commandeered by medics and nurses who used them to reach the unreachable. Commanders quietly tolerated it, because every recovered wounded soldier meant one fewer telegram sent home. That night, her Jeep became both ambulance and lifeboat, proof that sometimes survival depended not on firepower, but on mobility and will. 3. The technological angle. The Willys MB Jeep was never designed for comfort. Its steel frame rattled over every rock. Its seats were bare canvas stretched over metal. But it was revolutionary because it made movement universal. Before the war, armies relied on horses or trucks that bogged down in mud. The Jeep changed that. Weighing barely a ton with a 60-horsepower engine, it could go anywhere a man could walk, and usually faster. It had no armor, no luxury, and no real protection. Yet it was as dependable as gravity. To soldiers, it was a symbol of freedom and endurance. To medics, it was salvation. The vehicle's open body allowed stretchers to be secured with straps or wooden frames. Some field modifications added a canvas roof or blackout lamps. Others removed windshields to reduce glare during night runs. The nurse's stolen Jeep bore the marks of such improvisation, a war machine reshaped by human need. The Jeep also represented a shift in warfare itself, the triumph of mobility over mass. In an age of tanks and bombers, this little machine was a reminder that small-scale movement could still change outcomes. In post-war interviews, engineers from Willys Overland spoke proudly of how the Jeep became this soldier's friend. It was used to haul guns, carry generals, tow planes, and in this case, ferry the wounded from hell to safety. Its power lay in simplicity, a kind of mechanical honesty that matched the nurse's own quiet resolve. She didn't need permission to understand what the machine could do. All she needed was a reason. And in that rain-soaked forest surrounded by dying men, she found one. That night, the engine's roar became the sound of rebellion against despair, one small act that would ripple through hundreds of lives. Her Jeep wasn't a symbol yet. It was simply running.
4. The leadership angle. War tests leadership not only on the battlefield, but in the silence that follows orders. In 1944, military discipline was absolute. A soldier could be court-martialed for disobeying even the smallest command, and that rigidity extended to the medical corps. But there were officers who understood the space between regulation and reality, and it was in that gray space that quiet leadership often lived. When reports of the nurse's unauthorized vehicle use reached her commanding officer, the reaction was complex. On paper, he had to enforce order. Off paper, he knew what she had done had saved lives, that his supply chain had failed to reach. He chose to file her infraction in the mildest possible terms, temporary requisition of light transport for medical evacuation. That wording, bureaucratic and bloodless, shielded her from punishment. Such decisions reflected a deeper truth of the Allied campaign. Success often depended on those willing to bend rules in the name of necessity. Commanders who understood this rarely spoke of it, but they knew that wars were not won by obedience alone. Behind every general's plan stood hundreds of nameless leaders, nurses, drivers, engineers, whose courage operated in silence. Their influence came not from authority, but from conviction.
In interviews decades later, veterans often remembered acts of humanity, not rank. They remembered the nurse who refused to rest, who commandeered a jeep and drove through enemy fire, who loaded men alone because no one else would. That kind of leadership didn't earn medals, but it set examples that reshaped the moral fabric of every soldier who witnessed it. Leadership, at its purest, is moral clarity under chaos. And on that night, behind enemy lines, it belonged to her. 5. The enemy angle. The German soldiers patrolling the Lorraine woods that night were themselves exhausted. Many were boys conscripted into a crumbling army. Others, veterans of the Eastern Front brought west to slow the Allied tide. Their orders were simple: delay, disrupt, retreat only when forced. In the darkness, movement meant danger. Vehicles drew attention, and any vehicle moving in enemy-held territory was a target. The nurse knew this. She had seen German flares arc overhead, white blossoms of light illuminating the shattered trees. Each trip was a gamble that none of those flares would catch the glint of metal or the shape of a cross. Accounts from German field reports mention occasional Allied medical vehicles operating without markings. Whether one of those notes referred to her remains unproven, but it's likely. Enemy patrols were under orders to avoid unnecessary engagement with marked medics. Yet in the chaos of night operations, mercy was not always possible. That she was never intercepted remains a testament to both chance and courage. In occupied zones, capture could mean interrogation or worse. The Geneva Convention offered little protection when front lines blurred and soldiers were desperate. But her defiance also revealed something larger: that compassion could exist even at reach of the enemy. In a war defined by industrial death, this small act of human persistence, risking everything to rescue the wounded, stood as an answer to the cruelty of the age. While German officers wrote of enemy activity, she was performing her own counteroffensive against fear itself. 6. The moral angle. Every war eventually forces those who serve to decide what kind of human being they want to remain. The nurse's decision to take the jeep wasn't about disobedience, it was about the boundaries of conscience. Military law demands obedience. Humanity demands something more. The space between the two is where moral courage lives. To steal a vehicle, to drive unarmed through combat zones, to expose oneself to enemy fire. These acts were not sanctioned, yet the moral arithmetic was unambiguous. Every trip she made meant another man breathing by morning. Every refusal to stop meant another family spared the telegram that began with, "We regret to inform you." Her act embodied a paradox at the heart of war, that sometimes saving life requires breaking the rules designed to preserve order. Soldiers lived by discipline, nurses lived by compassion. But compassion, taken far enough, becomes its own form of defiance. Years later, military ethicists studying World War II medical conduct would use such cases to illustrate what they called situational morality, the point at which human conscience supersedes command structure. She never read those papers. She didn't need to. Her moral code was written in mud and blood long before the theorists gave it a name. The men she saved didn't call her a thief. They called her a savior. To them, the stolen jeep was not a violation. It was proof that humanity could still triumph amid destruction. And in the end, that was the quiet revolution she began, a reminder that even within the machinery of total war, a single act of compassion could still alter the outcome of hundreds of lives. Her story, like the jeep itself, rolled forward, gathering momentum, whispered through field hospitals, then carried home by those who owed her their lives. It would all come to a head in the days that followed, when the line between chaos and salvation collapsed entirely.
Dawn came with no ceremony, just a pale gray light spreading over the soaked fields of Lorraine. Smoke drifted between the trees, carrying the smell of burned fuel and antiseptic. The nurse hadn't slept in more than 40 hours. Her hands were cracked from the cold, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But there was no time to stop. The forest was full of men still calling out for help. Her jeep, once olive green, was now streaked with blood, mud, and ash. The red cross she had hastily painted on the hood was barely visible beneath the grime. The windshield was gone, shattered by debris during one of her night runs, but the engine still turned over, coughing, wheezing, and then growling to life. The battle had shifted during the night. Allied units were pushing east toward Metz, while German rearguards fought a series of brutal delaying actions. That left hundreds of wounded stranded in pockets of contested ground. The nurse knew the routes better than most soldiers by now. Each trip meant threading her way through broken villages and shell-pocked fields, where the distinction between friend and enemy had become a blur of uniforms and shadows. She drove with blackout lights, trusting her memory and instinct. The road to the nearest functioning aid station wound past an old farmhouse that had become a temporary command post. On her first run that morning, she found 3 men in the barn, one missing a leg, another blinded by shrapnel, the third clutching a radio that no longer worked. She loaded them one by one, strapping them into the jeep as shells thundered miles away. On the second run, she detoured toward a collapsed bridge where engineers had reported survivors. The air stank of diesel and cordite. Beneath the twisted girders, she found 2 medics trying to move a wounded lieutenant onto a door they were using as a stretcher. They looked up, disbelieving when they saw her. She shouted over the roar of the engine, "I can take him." They hesitated, then nodded. The lieutenant was lifted into the jeep, pale and unconscious. She drove off before anyone could ask her who had given the order. Each trip blurred into the next. The engine backfired. The tires slid in the mud. Twice she had to jump out and dig the jeep free with her hands. German artillery fire grew closer. Once, a strafing run by a Messerschmitt swept the road behind her, bullets tearing through the trees like metallic rain. She didn't stop. There was no safe direction, only forward. At some point, the fuel gauge began to drop below a quarter tank. She found a wrecked U.S. supply truck in a ditch and siphoned what she could. Her uniform was soaked in gasoline, her fingers raw. But the jeep started again, stubborn as she was. The small field hospital she brought her casualties to was a canvas tent pitched beside a half-collapsed stone wall. Inside, doctors worked by lantern light, sleeves rolled up, faces ghostly under the glow. When they saw her, they stopped. Not in recognition, but disbelief. "Where did you get that vehicle?" one asked. "Borrowed it," she said flatly, as orderlies pulled the wounded from the back. There was no time for questions. She turned the jeep around before the next shelling began. By midday, she had made 6 runs, then 7. The roads were littered with the debris of 2 armies. The rain returned, turning dust into a gray film that coated everything, her hands, her eyes, the men she carried. During one return trip, a round exploded so close that it lifted the rear tires off the ground. She was thrown sideways, the vehicle spinning half around before slamming into a ditch. The world went white with sound. When she came to, the windshield frame had bent inward, the front axle twisted, but the engine was still humming faintly beneath the hood. She laughed once, a dry, hollow sound, then climbed out and checked the wounded in the back. Both were alive. One was praying. The other whispered for water. She handed him her canteen, then climbed back behind the wheel. The jeep lurched, spat smoke, and clawed its way out of the ditch. That was the moment she realized she wasn't just evacuating the wounded. She was fighting the war in her own way. The jeep had become an extension of her will, defying everything the front lines dictated. As dusk fell again, she parked near the remnants of the forest aid station, now reduced to a few tarps and the flicker of a single lamp. Around her were the survivors she had carried out through the night. Some slept. Some stared silently at the canopy above them, unable to believe they were still alive. Her arms trembled from exhaustion. The jeep engine finally stuttered and died, its tank dry, its body riddled with holes. In the quiet that followed, she could hear the distant sound of another barrage, the front still moving,
still devouring everything in its path. But for now, in this patch of earth carved out of chaos, life had won. And the nurse who had stolen a jeep had become the only line between survival and silence.
Night again. The rain had stopped, but fog had taken its place, a dense, ghostly curtain over the forest. Every sound was amplified, the hiss of cooling metal, the faint rattle of spent shells underfoot, the low moans of men half-conscious in the dark. The nurse's hands shook uncontrollably now. The fuel was gone. Her body ached from the weight of stretchers. Her shoulders rubbed raw where her field pack had cut through the fabric of her uniform. She had driven for nearly 30 hours without rest. But word had spread through the wounded who could still speak. "There's a nurse out there with a jeep. She's coming back." And she did. When the last drops of gasoline ran dry, she scavenged from wrecks, punctured drums, overturned half-tracks, anything that smelled like fuel. She used a length of medical tubing as a siphon, coughing as fumes filled her lungs. Every drop mattered. Each trip into the dark was a trade, her safety for their chance. The forest roads were no longer recognizable. Fallen trees, cratered bridges, and abandoned artillery blocked the way. Once she came upon a German field gun still smoldering, its crew gone, the breech open like a mouth frozen mid-shout. She swerved past it, headlights off, the jeep whispering through the mist. At the edge of a ruined village, she found another cluster of wounded men, paratroopers who'd been cut off since the previous day. One of them tried to stand when he saw her, disbelief written across his mud-caked face. You're a nurse?" he stammered. She only nodded, already reaching for his arm. There were 8 of them. She could carry 2 at a time. The others would have to wait. "I'll come back," she said quietly. "Stay low. Keep quiet." And she did come back, again and again. Every trip became shorter, faster, more desperate. She learned to navigate by the glow of distant explosions, by the broken silhouettes of barns and church steeples. Once a German patrol passed within 50 yards of her, flashlights cutting through the fog. She froze, engine silent, hand gripping the gear stick as if it could make her invisible. One soldier stepped closer, the light brushing across the jeep's fender, and then moved on. It was near dawn when the final run came. The road ahead led to a shallow river crossing where Allied engineers had set up a temporary bridge. Beyond it lay friendly lines and safety. She had 3 wounded men in the jeep and another on the hood, tied down with belts. The vehicle groaned under the weight. Mud sucked at the tires. Each turn of the wheels felt like the last. Halfway across the riverbed, the engine sputtered, then died. Water crept over the tires. The current tugged at her boots as she jumped out, pushing against the frame. The wounded moaned softly, one whispering a prayer in the half-light. She pushed until her knees gave way, until her lungs burned, until the jeep began to inch forward once more. Then a shout, American voices from the opposite bank. Hands reached out through the mist, grabbing, pulling, hauling the vehicle up onto solid ground. She collapsed beside it, soaked and shaking, staring at the sky that was slowly turning from gray to gold. Someone knelt beside her, a medic, face streaked with mud. "Ma'am," he said, barely believing it. "Where the hell did you come from?" She didn't answer. She just looked back toward the fog, toward the forest that still hid the ones she couldn't reach. That morning, as the sun broke through, the tally began. More than 400 wounded had been brought out over 3 days, some by her,
some by soldiers she'd inspired to follow her route once word spread. The aid station overflowed. Trucks lined the roads, loaded with the living instead of the dead. Later, an officer wrote in his log, "Evacuation accomplished by improvised means. Unidentified nurse instrumental in retrieval of wounded from enemy-held sector." There was no medal, no citation, no photograph. Just that single line. But in those men, the story traveled like gospel of a nurse and her stolen jeep that refused to stop. For a brief, defiant moment, amid the machinery of destruction, she had bent the war toward mercy. And though the guns would keep firing for months to come, that single act proved that courage was not measured in orders followed, but in lives saved when there was no one left to give them. The jeep would later be found abandoned near the river, its tires bald, its engine cracked, its steering column twisted from overuse. Soldiers painted the word "Angel" on the hood before it was hauled away. No one knew what became of the nurse after that week. Some said she was reassigned, others that she refused to talk about what happened. But her legend, if it could be called that, lived on in whispers, in the grateful letters of the men she saved, in the quiet pride of medics who now saw what one person could do when orders failed. Because history remembers battles by their victories, but humanity remembers them by their mercy. And in those impossible 3 days behind enemy lines, mercy had found its engine.
When the guns finally fell silent over Lorraine, what remained was a landscape of exhaustion. The air smelled of wet soil and antiseptic. Trees were split open as if by lightning, and the fields were littered with bandages that the rain refused to bury. The wounded were gone now, trucked to field hospitals or shipped to evacuation units farther west. But the story of how they had been saved traveled faster than any convoy. At the 45th Field Hospital near Nancy, officers tried to reconstruct the timeline. Reports from medics, engineers, and drivers all spoke of a lone nurse operating an unregistered vehicle, bringing in groups of wounded who otherwise would have been written off as lost. The numbers were staggering, over 400 men across 3 days. No one could explain how she had managed it, or why she hadn't been killed in the process. In official dispatches, the event appeared only as a footnote. Multiple successful evacuations executed under extreme conditions. Unit nurses performed above expectation. The bureaucracy of war smoothed the story into anonymity. But among the men who had ridden in that jeep, bleeding, delirious, half dead, anonymity was impossible. They remembered her face, the mud on her uniform, the steady calm of her hands on the steering wheel. One survivor, Private Raymond L. Carter of the 80th Infantry Division, later wrote in a letter home, "There was this nurse. She just appeared. We thought she was lost, but she wasn't. She knew exactly where to go. I remember the sound of that jeep. It meant we were going to live." Such letters began to circulate through the Army postal network, copied, retold, reshaped with every retelling. By the time the war ended, she was a ghostly legend, the nurse who stole a jeep and saved an army. Back at her unit, there was little celebration. She was summoned to the command tent for questioning. The colonel in charge, a career officer who measured the war in maps and reports, looked at her for a long time before speaking. "Did you take a vehicle without authorization?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that's an offense under military law?" "Yes, sir." A pause. Then quietly, "You saved how many?" "I don't know, sir, as many as I could." He sighed, signed her report, and wrote a single word across the top, "Commended." Then he dismissed her with a nod. There was no medal ceremony,
No photograph for the press. That was not how the U.S. Army honored its nurses in 1944. Their bravery was expected, not celebrated. They were to serve, not to stand out. But within the Corps, her act became a touchstone, a whispered story told in tents and hospital corridors from France to Italy. The other nurses knew what it meant. The constant struggle between obedience and compassion, the quiet guilt of surviving when others didn't. Her defiance had given them permission not to disobey, but to trust their own judgment when bureaucracy faltered. In the months that followed, new guidelines were issued for frontline medical mobility. The Army began approving more Jeep-based ambulance conversions, adding brackets for stretchers and improved suspension for rough terrain. Officially, these changes were attributed to field adaptation and necessity. Unofficially, they were inspired by stories like hers, by what happened when one nurse refused to let regulation dictate the value of a human life. As the Lorraine campaign gave way to the push toward the Rhine, the memory of that act endured. Every time a medic strapped a wounded man onto the back of a jeep and drove through gunfire, they were repeating her motion, her courage, her impossible gamble. War moves quickly. Names fade. But actions have a strange persistence, especially those born of mercy. In the mud of France, among broken engines and burned-out trucks, a single act of theft had rewritten what it meant to serve.
In the months that followed, the war pressed onward, across the Moselle, through the Siegfried Line, into the frozen hell of the Ardennes. The headlines spoke of divisions and breakthroughs, of generals and grand strategy. But somewhere beneath that noise, the quieter victories remained, the ones that would never be written into campaign maps. Among the nurses of the U.S. Army, word of the stolen Jeep spread not as myth, but as a kind of whispered oath. In makeshift wards from Reims to Luxembourg, medics would joke, "If she could do it, so can we," before driving out under fire to bring in another stretcher case. Her story gave shape to something they had all felt, but rarely said aloud, that mercy, in war, often demanded disobedience. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps had long fought for recognition. Before the war, nurses were classified as civilians in uniform, unpaid for combat service, excluded from rank privileges. By 1944, that had begun to change. They now held officer status, wore bars on their collars, and carried the respect of the men they saved. Yet even so, their bravery rarely reached the official communiques. Their battlefield was invisible, waged not with bullets, but with will. When the Lorraine campaign was finally secured, the Army's medical branch conducted an internal review. Reports noted the extraordinary evacuation efficiency in sectors that had previously suffered catastrophic mortality rates. Many of those improvements traced back to field improvisations, nurses and medics commandeering jeeps, repurposing them as mobile triage units. What had once been an act of insubordination was now quietly codified as authorized field initiative. The legacy of her act was practical before it was moral. New designs appeared, stretchers bolted to frames, canopies added for rain protection, engine shields reinforced for rough ground. The Jeep ambulance became standard issue by the war's final year. No one officially credited the nameless nurse, but those who knew, knew. For the men who survived because of her, the memory never faded. In veterans' reunions years later, they still spoke of her. Some remembered her as blonde, others dark-haired. Some swore she wore captain's bars, others said she had none. But all remembered the same details: the sound of that engine in the night, the way she didn't speak much, only drove, steady, relentless, as if guided by something larger than courage.
After the war, many nurses returned home quietly. They married, worked in hospitals, raised families. Some never spoke about what they had seen. Others tried, and found no one willing to listen. The nurse who drove that Jeep may have been among them, a face lost in the flood of returning servicewomen. But her legacy endured where it mattered most, in the doctrine of battlefield medicine and in the conscience of every medic who came after. When the U.S. Army published its official medical history in the early 1950s, a short passage stood out in a section titled Evacuation Under Fire. It read, "In numerous instances, field personnel demonstrated exceptional initiative in the recovery of wounded under adverse conditions. Improvised transport, particularly light reconnaissance vehicles, played an invaluable role in saving lives otherwise beyond reach." It was a sanitized acknowledgement, stripped of names, but behind those lines was the echo of her wheels in the dark. By the time historians revisited the Lorraine campaign decades later, the exact details of her story had blurred. Some questioned the numbers. 400 seemed impossible for one person. But the evidence of her impact was undeniable. The record showed a sudden drop in mortality rates among isolated units during those same 3 days. The Jeep, though unremarkable among thousands, had become a symbol of something far rarer, the triumph of empathy over machinery. Her act had changed how armies thought about saving lives. It had shown that technology, no matter how advanced, meant nothing without the will to use it for compassion. And so, in the quiet reckoning that followed war, her crime had become her legacy, a testament to the idea that the greatest victories in history are not always the loudest, nor the most decorated, but the ones born of conscience when the world demands obedience. From that muddy forest in 1944 to every battlefield since, the echo of that engine endures, a reminder that courage, at its purest, is mercy in motion. War is often remembered through the thunder of guns, the clash of nations, and the orders of generals. But beneath that noise lies another kind of story, quiet, unrecorded, human. The nurse who stole a Jeep behind enemy lines did not change the course of the war. She did not capture cities or win medals. What she changed was something deeper, the boundary between duty and compassion. Her act stands as a reminder that even amid industrialized killing, the smallest choices can echo longest. A single woman, exhausted, unarmed, surrounded by chaos, made a decision that saved hundreds. She did not wait for permission or for history to take notice. She simply refused to let despair dictate the outcome. The men who survived because of her, the memory never faded. In veterans' reunions years later, they still spoke of her. Some remembered her as blonde, others dark-haired. Some swore she wore captain's bars, others said she had none. But all remembered the same details, the sound of that engine in the night, the way she didn't speak much, only drove, steady, relentless, as if guided by something larger than courage. In the years that followed, as new wars arose and new technologies emerged, the lesson endured. The field medics in Korea, the helicopter crews in Vietnam, the combat nurses in Iraq and Afghanistan, they all carried a fragment of her legacy, that saving one life, under fire or in defiance, is the most sacred form of resistance. And perhaps that is how history truly moves forward, not by orders, but by compassion. Because somewhere in the archives, among faded maps and typed reports, one line still stands. Evacuation accomplished by improvised means. Unidentified nurse instrumental in retrieval of wounded from enemy-held sector. No name, no medal, just proof that sometimes a single act of mercy can carry farther than an army. And so the engine fades, the forest grows silent again, and history turns its page, leaving behind only the echo of that stolen jeep rumbling through the rain, carrying the wounded home.